Welcome to Like Maria. Today we're going to look at one of Keats's sonnets. It's called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, and we're going to look at this in the context of an essay question. So the essay question would be, explore Keats's presentation of a sense of excitement in his poem On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. You must include comments about context. So this is on the A-level syllabus, but the context discussed here might be useful for other romantic poets as well. So first of all, just a review of the poem. This is a poem where Keats reflects on his journey through literature. He talks about having read the great poets and understanding literature, and then he moves forward to the experience of reading Homer. After he's read Homer, he moves on to another level and he realises what he was missing out on. So there is a great sense here that he moves on in his understanding of poetry. There's a big epiphany in the centre of the poem where he moves to another level of understanding. I'm going to talk about this in different sections. We're going to talk about Keats's admiration for literature. We're going to talk contextually about the speed with which this poem was written. We're going to look at some biographical details of Keats, the sonnet form, and then some general remarks about poetry in the 19th century. So, first of all, it is widely known that Keats had great admiration for other poets from history. He carried a portrait of Shakespeare around with him. He often spoke about Shakespeare, for example, in his King Lear sonnet. And he emulated the great poets of English writing, particularly Milton and Spenser. Milton he almost over-emulated in his epic poem Hyperion. He finished it early, not completing it actually, saying that it had become too Miltonic. So he did have a penchant for copying and emulating poets because he revered them greatly. He refers to these in the first couple of lines of the sonnet. He says, "Much have I travelled in the realms of gold." He talks about realms of gold, kingdoms and bard. The bard is a specific reference to Shakespeare. He suggests that by this rich imagery, gold and kingdoms, that he has a great deal of respect for these poets, that they are kings and monarchs of English literature. He also refers in this sonnet to the god Apollo, who was a god of poetry and who appears in Hyperion, one of Keats's other poems. So he does talk about the importance of mythology and an understanding of literature that came before him, that he's travelled in these realms and that helps him and supports him. And he talks about how much he's enjoyed this and how important this was to him. In fact, we know that Keats wants to become like Shakespeare and Milton. He seeks to be a prophet amongst poets, a priest amongst poets, and a king amongst poets. He wants to be up there in the realms of gold. This was part of the Romantic tradition where poets aspired to be great leaders in their time, both in terms of creating poetry, but also politically in some instances. Now, this sonnet has a great sense of immediacy and excitement about it, and it was written in one night after staying up reading with his friend. They read Homer. Now, it's called Chapman's Homer because Chapman translated it into English. But it was the first time that Keats had seen a translation of Homer. He'd never been able to read Homer properly because he couldn't read Greek. So they stayed up at the night reading this. Apparently Keats, according to a friend, shouted with delight when he read this. And this is very typical of a romantic poet, to become so immersed in poetry and creative activity that he shouted with delight. And what does he do? He goes and writes a sonnet about it. We see this in other places with Keats. We see it in Ode to a Nightingale, where he sees a nightingale and runs off and writes a poem, an ode in that case. And in On the Sea, where he was holidaying by the sea and is enthused to write a poem about the sea because it is visually present for him. So this sense of immediacy in the poem is supported by the contextual detail. We also know that he was looked down upon a little in the realm of poets. Many people at the time called him the Cockney poet. He felt disadvantaged by his education and his class, and in quite a snobbish way, some of the other poets didn't want him to be published because he wasn't of the right class or stature. We now look back on him as one of the greatest poets in the English language, but this wasn't always the case, and so we know he felt a little bit insecure. So this poem describes how he moves up a level. When he has experienced Homer, he feels like an explorer, and he's moved up a level, and he experiences the excitement of exploration. He is moving into a new realm. So this is a Petrarchan sonnet which allows for a volta between line 8 and line 9. This is traditional in sonnet writing, that there is a moment of change, a moment around which the poem turns, and this moment in sonnets is called a volta. Here this poem pivots around the word then in line 9. There is a strong stress on then. The poem comes out of the iambic pentameter here, and there is a stress here on that first word of the line. So this focuses on a revelation experience. When he has heard about Homer, he then writes a sonnet which is a poem of love and admiration. Shakespearean sonnets and other sonnets in the Elizabethan era were written to admire people, to people that you loved. And here it's not a woman that he's fallen in love with, it is Homer and the writings of the classical era. And it's notable that Homer's Odyssey, which was one of the poems in Chapman, is about a man going on a journey and exploring and then reaching his homecoming. So here it is as if Keats is almost placing himself in the character of one of Homer's creations, and that he is exploring on a journey and then coming home to the wonderful experience of reading Homer. I want to talk a little bit about the 19th century, a century of exploration and discovery. There were new methods of transport, such as the train, which enabled people to have new experience. But also there were people experiencing new worlds through study of the stars and use of new technology and new developments in technology such as telescopes. And here Keats uses the idea of discovering a new planet as a metaphor for him discovering Homer. So he feels that he's been transported into a new universe. It's not the old-fashioned travel where it took you to a new land and you explored new Americas, but here it's actually leaving the world. And this was a very romantic idea as well, that somehow poetry and literature could transform and transport a person into another being or another world. And here I think that's very important in the poem. I just want to read you a few lines concerning that. So he compares himself to some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Swimming into his ken is showing that it is swimming into his vision on the telescope. So we have a new planet a new world being opened up, and he felt also like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. And that silent there in the last line, with the pause after it, is the culmination of the excitement in this poem. There are no words really to express this excitement, and Keats pauses here after that word silent to share with us the moment of realization and epiphany and the joy with which his eyes are opened to new experience. So I hope that goes some way into helping you write an essay on Keats's presentation of excitement in Chapman's Homer, and I hope that today we've shown you how to solve a problem like Chapman's Homer.